This week, we're really focusing on media influence on society. And because of that, we really can't avoid talking about political theories, media regulation, and free speech because ultimately, when we talk about a lot of these media theories, what we really are observing is how they affect the general public. And we need to talk about how they affect the general public politically as well. And in accordance with that, we also need to talk about what sort of regulations exist to curb the media. The first theory I want to talk about today is selective and limited influences theory. This theory came from early mass media studies, and it was one of the theories that helped to discredit that magic bullet theory, right? The one that said, whatever the media says, it's basically injected right into your brain, and that's how you interpret it and remember it. And selective and limited influences theory said, whoa, that's not quite right. There's a lot of things that influence how we interpret information and how we form our own opinions. So it really emphasized this idea that individual psychological and sociological factors also affected how we interpret media. And for most of us, this probably makes really clear sense, right? The idea that because we have different backgrounds, we have different lived experiences, we have different values, sometimes different cultural values, we're going to interpret media differently because we are working from different sets of information. And this is the one that really showed that yes, the media might have influence, and yes, the media might have some control, but ultimately we are still individuals, and that individual nature means that our interpretations are often varied. Now, your textbook talks about some key studies on media influence, and I think these are really good to be familiar with because they look at this idea, especially in like the early age of media, just how sensational it was and the type of impact that was readily observable. Certainly nowadays, media and especially digital media are a big part of our lives, but a lot of these early studies became really prevalent when media was just rising. So the War of the Worlds study, looking at that radio show that convinced people that there was a war going on outside because it sounded so realistic and created audience panic. Or even looking at the army films we distributed during World War II and how those had mixed effects on morale overall, how they affected them psychologically. The pain fun studies looking at early movie influence research and the idea of how watching moving images might influence us. And all of these really did show that there was selective audience interpretation. In very rare instances, did the audiences all act the same exact way or react the same exact way. It showed that there really was a spectrum in terms of how audiences interpreted information, how seriously they took information, and how they ultimately understood and comprehended the information that was being presented. Now, part of why this might be is because we also have to look to accumulation theory. And accumulation theory is something we've kind of already talked about, especially when we look back at cultivation theory, with this idea that media effects accumulate over time. It means it's not something that just is going to happen instantaneously for us. This messaging needs to be consistent and persistent. So when we talk about repeating messaging, when we talk about message exposure happening again and again, this is what we're talking about, that accumulation of the messaging. Remember, it's very difficult for us to understand something completely the first time we hear it. In fact, we can only really remember about 25% of what we hear. Not a great statistic, but by hearing something again and again, it helps us remember it better. So that's why we look at this consistent and persistent messaging to affirm accumulation theory. Now, there are some campaigns we could look to that really represent accumulation theory, like anti-smoking campaigns, the seatbelt law campaigns, or even just gauging social attitudes can tell us how media effects are accumulating over time. So when we're seeing a decrease in drinking in Gen Z, that's a really interesting, observable case study to wonder what sort of media effects accumulated there that might have created that response. Another early study was the People's Choice Study in 1940, and this study led to what we call the two-step flow of communication. And what the two-step flow of communication basically says is that some media messages first reach opinion leaders before they reach opinion followers, or what we would often think of as the broader public or general public. And so what it says is these opinion leaders then influence the broader public through their personal interactions. Now, opinion leaders can be a lot of different people. Opinion leaders could certainly be news organizations or reporters, but sometimes there are people who are experts in their field. Sometimes they're celebrities or influencers. Sometimes they are people who have authoritative roles like the mayor or the president. But these are people we might look to because we respect them and we respect their opinion. And because of that, we often follow their opinion. Now, I won't get into the depths of this, and I don't expect you to know the differences between them, but there are what we call formal and informal opinion leaders. Formal opinion leaders are going to be people who lead opinion based on role, right? So your authoritative roles, right? Your boss, the president, the mayor, someone you respect and listen to, but has a role of authority. Then informal opinion leaders are going to be the people whose opinions you're just really invested in. Maybe they align with you a lot. Maybe there's someone you really care about or trust really well. But this is where we see things like influencers or our own social connections influencing our opinion. And in the case where opinion leaders have sometimes that first access to information, and then they're the ones that share that information with us, we have to understand that there's going to be some sort of agenda setting or at least opinion sharing happening there. Now, the role of opinion leaders, well, oftentimes they're more engaged with media content because they need to be heavily informed. They then interpret and pass that information to others. And we see this in a variety of settings, certainly in politics, but also in marketing and in community influence. There are a bunch of different types of opinion leaders, and I think a good activity to really think about yourself is, who are the opinion leaders in my life? Whose opinions do I really care about, and who do I look to for reliable and accurate information? Now, because we've spent time talking about media influence, we also need to talk about media regulation. So I want to tell you a bit about how the media itself is regulated, particularly in the United States. So certainly you should be familiar with the First Amendment. The First Amendment is sort of the first place we look to how the media can be regulated in the United States. And it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and you'll notice that's bolded because that's the media, or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So this really stresses this idea that the press itself should be free of government restriction, should be free of government interaction. Now, there are things we will talk about that do actually regulate the media, but the idea here is that they should not intervene in a way that prevents information from being shared or causes censorship of information. And that's because under the First Amendment, political speech has one of the highest protections. So when we talk about the things that are happening in the government, oftentimes those are the cases we see most highly protected under the First Amendment. Now, the Communications Act of 1930 came to rise when we really started to see a lot of these media technologies evolve rapidly. So keep in mind, around the 1930s, this is where we're really seeing the media landscape shift and change from just print to digital media as well. So this is where we see the establishment of the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. And the FCC is ultimately who's going to regulate interstate and international communications that happen through cable, radio, television, satellite, and wire. So specifically looking at that digital media component, because again, this is something that's rapidly evolving in the 1930s, and they want to make sure they're paying attention to what's happening on these channels of communication. So, what are some things that we can regulate in the media or we have seen regulated in the media? Well, first, indecency and obscenity. The Safe Harbor Law says that no indecent material broadcasts from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. on public airwaves. This is meant to protect minors, right? The idea that nothing indecent is going to be shown during the general time that a minor might be awake. Indecent material is protected speech, but obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. And this has created a lot of litigation and issues back and forth, but we've definitely seen this shift a bit as public airwaves become less popular and we see more of a shift to streaming services. We also know that copyright is heavily regulated when it comes to the media. We have the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is going to criminalize the production and dissemination of technology or devices that might circumvent the control to access copyrighted works. And then we also have fair use. This is a legal doctrine that allows limited use of copyrighted material without permission from the copyright holder. This is really the only loophole in copyright law, but it's looking to balance the rights of the public with the copyright holder, which is the idea that it's potentially possible that there's a copyright that the public needs access to and needs to be able to use without having to consistently ask for permission from the copyright holder. Now, what falls under fair use often takes time, and it often takes the exception of showing how you're going to use it, because the public can't use a copyright to benefit from it financially. It's really only in the case of benefiting from it positively. And usually the real carve out here ends up being for education purposes. That's probably the most common exception we see fair use used for. So making sure my students have access to a book or article that is important for their education, that might allow me to have access to a copyrighted work and reproduce it for my class. Now, the media can't just write whatever it wants because of the First Amendment. They do have to pay close attention to some other ways that they are regulated, particularly in the case of defamation. Defamation is something that can really result in litigation or lawsuits. And there's two main types, libel and slander. Libel is defamation that happens in writing, whereas slander is defamation that happens aloud, right? Usually on some sort of broadcast. And when we talk about defamation, there's a couple main things that you have to be aware of. First, it's only defamation if what was written or said aloud is not true, right? Just because it might be something unsavory or something private or something someone didn't want to share publicly, that does not necessarily mean defamation. Defamation only happens when something is untrue. However, when we talk about proving defamation, there's a second component. It's not just proving that something was untrue, it's also proving that it caused damage. So it caused some sort of financial damage, opportunity damage, reputational damage, to the degree that it's impacted your life. So this becomes a heavy burden of proof of a defamation victim to have to show in court. And that's why oftentimes celebrities, defamation suits get dropped or settled out of court because that burden of proof is so high for a celebrity. Whereas a general citizen might be able to very clearly say, hey, this lie was published about me, and because of it, I lost my job, I lost my healthcare, I lost my professional reputation, right? And they can easily show the court those damages. Whereas a lot of celebrities, they might be defamed, truthfully, right? It might be untrue information that's shared about them, like in a gossip mag. But their responsibility then becomes to show how that defamation damaged their career or damaged them personally. So it creates a really tough scenario. We also look at media ownership in terms of how things are regulated. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was really directed at limiting monopolies in the telephone market. And even though landlines have sort of gone to the wayside, we still see this applied to cell service and even extended further in terms of how different types of media are used, like access to airwaves, access to broadcast, because we do live in a highly conglomerate environment when it comes to media organizations where it's kind of like the four same media organizations own everything. And we see this constantly coming under litigation, under review by the government. I will say since 1996, 30 years ago, we've definitely seen this act become a little bit more laissez-faire, right? It's not as heavily enforced as it was in the early 90s, mid 2000s. Now, when we talk about these news and political theories, we do have to visit the different models that are applied to the media. First, we have the liberal pluralist model, and we've sort of talked about these before, but I want to kind of break them down a little bit further so you understand how the media is viewed differently in different media models, right? So how we view the power of the news can shift depending on our own model we identify with. So the liberal pluralist model is going to say that media is the fourth estate of societal power, therefore it should not be censored. This was presented in the idea that the media should serve as a marketplace of ideas, right? There should be all different perspectives, all different opinions. This really should be a focus on just making information available and not preventing any of it from getting out. And what John Stuart Mill said in 1859, so way back when, he said the censored opinion may be true and the accepted opinion might not. And so we need to be very mindful of censorship because we may be either advertently or inadvertently preventing the correct or true position from being released. Even truth needs to be challenged and tested. So already emphasizing that importance for critical thinking, questioning, or being skeptical of what we read in the media. And that there is likely some truth in all opinions. In many cases, we often can rationalize towards the truth in our own opinions because we often think things are one way based on the set of information we have. And sometimes when new information is presented, that may shift our truth as well. I like this perspective from John Stuart Mill because it really looks at this idea that we cannot be passive consumers of the media and we cannot be passive contributors to the media. We really need to think about what is true, what is accurate, and what is going to best serve, since this is a part of societal power. It recognizes that significance of the media as influential, of persuasiveness, of really affecting public policy. So he really created that idea that the media is a marketplace of ideas, that we should be able to come to the media and pick and choose what we think, what we care about, what we believe, and be able to have access to easy to understand and accurate information about those ideas. Now, the theory of social responsibility looks more at this idea of the obligations of media or what they should be accountable for. So this idea that they're actually obligated to serve society. They're not necessarily just a power in society, but they are someone who should be feeling responsible to the general public. And it stresses the idea that news media should be truthful, accurate, fair, objective, and relevant, right? What most of us are looking for in our media, unbiased. It should be free and self-regulated when necessary. This idea that by allowing them to be free, we can assure they're uncensored. The media should follow some codes of ethics and professional conduct, especially because we want to believe them as trustworthy and credible sources. And that the government should really only intervene in the public interest. So when something's happening with the media that maybe forgoes their obligation to society or is causing damage, that's when we might see the government intervene. But overall, it's saying, hey, the media has a responsibility to us and they need to take that responsibility serious. Now, our last model we'll look at is the communitarian theory, which is that media is an agent of community formation. Therefore, it's the community who should regulate it. They should have the say in how the agenda is set, how the story is framed. The media should also engage with the public it serves because then it can directly observe the impact the media has. And they look at this idea that the media really is for civic transformation, that not only should they influence the public, they should influence policy and they should help us achieve the public's goals through this civic transformation. Now, all three of these models, and you can decide which one you identify with most or you think really should be the prominent model for our media in the United States. But the reality is I think our media model in the States is sort of a mix of all of these, right? This idea of obligation to an audience, but also using some of that agenda setting and framing is certainly existent in the news media today. Now, the reason why I present these models to you is because I want you to be informed as you're consuming media. Ask yourselves, what is at play here? What models am I observing in the media I read, in the media I watch? Because the more literate you are as a media consumer, the easier it's going to be for you to really pick out some of these biases and skewed facts that we do see appear in the media every day.